The Substance, 2024 thriller movie shocks audiences. This is one of the most disgusting movies I've ever seen, and it's not recommended to watch while eating. Elizabeth was once a top Hollywood superstar, adored by millions. However, at over 50 years old, her glory days are long behind her, and she has aged significantly. Now, she struggles to stay relevant by hosting a fitness program on a local TV channel. During a break, Elizabeth needed to use the restroom, but the women's restroom was under maintenance, so she decided to enter the men's restroom instead. There, she overheard her boss angrily storming in, complaining about her. He said Elizabeth, as an outdated washed-up has-been with no popularity, should be kicked out. He mocked her for thinking she was still the young star she once was and planned to replace her with a younger woman. His harsh words deeply wounded Elizabeth's pride. Looking at her sagging skin in the mirror, she felt bitterly resentful but utterly powerless. On her way back, she saw her own billboard being removed without mercy. Distracted by the sight, she caused a car accident with another vehicle. Fortunately, she wasn't seriously hurt. However, the near-death experience didn't bring her relief. The reality of aging made her feel that living was worse than dying. As she was about to leave the hospital, an intern stopped her. He pressed on her spine and felt something under her skin, like a steel needle. The young, handsome intern told her, "You are our ideal candidate," and handed her her clothes. Elizabeth didn't think much of it, but as soon as she left the hospital, she found something unexpected in her pocket. Inside was a piece of paper wrapped around a USB drive. The note read, "This can change your life." At that moment, an old high school friend ran into her on the street. Although both of them had aged, her old classmate didn't hide his admiration for her. He suggested they should keep in touch more often. Back at her empty home, curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the USB drive. The video explained that by injecting a serum called the Substance, her cells could split and create a younger, more glamorous version of herself. Elizabeth dismissed it as nonsense and immediately threw the USB drive into the trash. But human nature is weak, and even the slightest chance tempted her to take a gamble. Determined, she followed the address written on the paper to a narrow alley. A small rolling door opened to reveal a hidden passage, and Elizabeth crawled through. Inside, the place was unexpectedly spacious. Following the instructions, she opened locker number 503. The box inside contains several layers. The first layer held an activation serum for her to use and dispose of after. The second layer contained supplies for the newly created self. The third layer contained a switch serum for swapping bodies between the original and the new self. The instructions said they needed to swap bodies every 7 days. Lastly, there were nutrient solutions for both the original and the new self. The instructions emphasized, "You two are one." After a brief internal struggle, Elizabeth undressed and injected the activation serum into her body. The moment she injected it, she felt dizzy and fainted. Soon after, her back began to writhe, as if something was pushing its way out. Suddenly, her back split open, and her eyes developed a strange double pupil effect. A human-like leg began to emerge from Elizabeth's back. Before long, a fair-skinned young woman, stunningly beautiful, came into the world. This new being possessed all of Elizabeth's memories but had a completely transformed body. Elizabeth was delighted with this mesmerizing figure. She stitched up her own back with needle and thread, reasoning that it was still part of herself. Then, she began administering the nutrient solution. After finishing everything, the new version of herself, named Sue, could enjoy this young, beautiful body for the next 7 days. However, Sue suddenly felt dizzy and noticed her nose bleeding. She realized she hadn't yet injected the stabilizing serum. The instructions were clear: 1 vial of stabilizer must be injected each day for 7 days. She quickly grabbed the syringe and got to work, extracting stabilizer from the primary body's back. She then injected it into herself. At that moment, she felt refreshed and confident. She headed to the TV station for an interview, determined to rebuild her glory. Sue's stunning beauty and perfect figure instantly caught the boss's attention, and he signed her on the spot, fully committed to making her a star. Having all of Elizabeth's memories and experience, Sue quickly became the brightest star at the station. She injected 1 vial of stabilizer every day and occasionally took care of the primary body in her spare time. A week passed quickly, and it was time for her to switch back with the primary body. Although she was reluctant, she used the transfer needle to connect their bodies together. Their blood began to mix, and suddenly Sue lost consciousness. Elizabeth woke up, the pain from her back almost unbearable, but seeing the unconscious version of herself lying there, she felt all her efforts were worth it. When Elizabeth returned to the TV station, the boss had already packed her things, eager to get rid of her. showing no hint of restraint in his joy. In her aged body, Elizabeth found it hard to muster enthusiasm for anything. Every week, the substance sent nutrient solutions for both the primary and the alternate body. Elizabeth spent her days in a haze, and Sue would take over. Sue's life was far more exciting than Elizabeth's, and she relished her exclusive 7-day span. However, the sight of Elizabeth lying in the bathtub irritated her, so she smashed the tub and prepared to stuff her inside. The commotion annoyed the neighbors, but as soon as they saw the fair-skinned, gorgeous Sue, their anger vanished. They even offered help if needed. Sue moved Elizabeth into a dark, cramped room and replaced Elizabeth's portraits with her own. With the boss's full support, Sue's fame skyrocketed. On the 7th night, after work, she invited a young man to her home, but the time for switching bodies had arrived, and she felt a splitting headache as blood poured from her nose. Panicked, she rushed to the dark room, finding the primary body's nutrient solution depleted. Yet her greed pushed her to want more time. Breaking the rules, she extracted another vial of stabilizer from the primary body and injected it into herself. Feeling renewed, she decided to deal with the switch later. On the 8th day, after their bodies switched back, Elizabeth emerged from the room to find her house in disarray. She spotted a helmet and a note left by the young man, saying, "I'll come back for the helmet in a few days." But Elizabeth noticed something was wrong. One of her fingers had become lifeless. Upon removing her clothes, she realized Sue had broken the rules by taking extra stabilizer from her body the previous day. She immediately called the substance company, asking if there was any way to recover. The operator coldly replied, "The other you has taken your vitality. There's no way to restore it." Elizabeth, enraged, protested, "I didn't know what she did. Why should I suffer for her mistakes?" The operator responded, "You are one entity. As long as the other you maintains balance, this won't happen." Then they hung up. Elizabeth was furious, but watching the other her on TV so radiant, even more beautiful than her younger self, filled her with jealousy. The next time she went to collect nutrient solutions, she realized she was being followed. The person trailing her was none other than the intern who introduced her to the substance. The elderly man revealed himself as the intern's primary body. He told Elizabeth, "Our only purpose now is to sustain the other version of ourselves." He added that the alternate body was consuming his life force. Horrified, Elizabeth fled. By coincidence, she ran into the handsome young man Sue had been dating. Faced with the old and haggard Elizabeth, the young man was far less patient and kind. This deepened Elizabeth's sense of injustice. To soothe her soul, she decided to contact her old high school friend, hoping to rediscover the joy of love. The two happily arranged a meeting place. Filled with anticipation, Elizabeth dressed elegantly and confidently prepared for their date. You could see Sue's delicate features and paper-thin lips, making Elizabeth feel utterly inferior in comparison. So she started reapplying makeup again, but Sue's presence was everywhere, and no matter how much Elizabeth dressed up or fixed her makeup, she was never satisfied. Eventually, she nearly drove herself insane and ended up missing her date with her old classmate. Another 7 days passed, and Elizabeth, abiding by the rules, exchanged blood with Sue. However, during a performance, something unexpected happened to Elizabeth. She noticed a large lump forming on her buttocks. In a panic, she used her hand to push it upward, and after much effort, she managed to move the lump to her navel. Then, she reached into her navel with her hand and began digging. To her shock, she pulled out an object. It was a fried chicken drumstick. When she returned to her show, she discovered it had already been cancelled. Worried that she might be permanently kicked out of the station, she was surprised when the boss told her that Sue's show had skyrocketed in ratings. The boss announced that Sue would now host the New Year's Eve program. This news made Sue overjoyed but also greedier. Ignoring the original agreement to exchange every 7 days, Sue drew 3 extra days of stabilizer from Elizabeth. It wasn't until the 10th day that Sue finally switched back. When Elizabeth woke up and saw her reflection, she descended into madness. Half of her body had already aged dramatically, and Sue's greed had left her body decaying even further. She immediately called the substance company to complain about Sue not adhering to the agreement. The company asked if she wanted to terminate the experience. She hesitated. Elizabeth's grotesque, deteriorating state made her incapable of taking care of herself. Meanwhile, the glamorous Sue had become the center of attention, basking in the limelight. The stark contrast between them was unbearable, especially when Sue mocked Elizabeth during a show. Sue joked that Elizabeth's old aerobics program was ancient, emphasizing they were from completely different eras. This completely enraged Elizabeth. She was furious that Sue had stolen her beauty. When the seventh day came and they exchanged again, Sue found the apartment in utter disarray, an expression of Elizabeth's frustration and resentment. The feud between the primary body and the alternate body had become irreconcilable. In a fit of anger, Sue drew dozens of vials of stabilizer from Elizabeth's body. She lived freely for 3 months but was still unsatisfied. When she tried to extract more after 3 months, she found the stabilizer had turned murky and black, making it unusable. Panicking, she called the substance company for a solution. The company explained that this was irreversible and that they would need to switch back to allow the primary body to generate more stabilizer. Reluctantly, Sue agreed. Using a transfusion tube, she barely managed to revive Elizabeth. But by this point, Elizabeth's body had completely decayed. Not wanting anyone to see her monstrous appearance, Elizabeth locked Sue's temporary boyfriend outside the door. Now filled with despair and rage, Elizabeth lashed out by driving the boyfriend away. She dragged her horrific body to the living room and called the substance company again. The next day, the company sent over the termination kit. Elizabeth wrapped herself up completely before leaving the house. Her neighbors, mistaking her for Sue, were shocked when such a monstrous figure emerged instead. At the station, Elizabeth opened a locker containing the termination kit, a small box. Determined, she dragged Sue out of the dark room and prepared to inject the termination serum into Sue. But just as she was about to finish the injection, she hesitated. She realized her former glory was gone forever. Sue was the only part of her that was still loved, and she stopped herself. Grabbing the transfusion tube, she tried to revive Sue. Sue woke up successfully, but upon seeing Elizabeth's monstrous form, she was horrified. The unfinished termination serum on the ground made Sue instantly realize Elizabeth had tried to destroy her. Though they were one, they were ultimately two separate conscious entities. Completely losing her mind, Sue kicked Elizabeth hard, sending her flying. Sue, now intent on killing, easily overpowered Elizabeth, whose frail, aged body stood no chance. Elizabeth was ultimately killed by Sue. However, as a secondary body, Sue couldn't survive without the primary body's stability. But that night was the New Year's Eve show, and she was determined to die in glory. As she applied makeup, she suddenly coughed and spit out a tooth. Then several more teeth fell out. But she remembered the activation serum left at home. Since she was split from Elizabeth, she wondered if she could create another alternate body. She fled the scene to avoid being seen in this state and rushed home. She injected the activation serum into herself and immediately fell unconscious. At that moment, she transitioned from being Elizabeth's alternate body to the primary body. But to her shock, the new alternate body was hideous. She had forgotten that the activation serum could only be used once. This new being was a grotesque fusion of Sue and Elizabeth, with Elizabeth as the dominant side. Still wanting to attend the show, she put on a gown, earrings, and a wig with a few strands of sparse hair. She used Elizabeth's portrait as a mask and returned to the event. The audience thought Sue was planning a surprise, but when the creature appeared on stage, everyone was horrified. The sight left the audience, especially those in the front row who paid a premium, with lasting trauma. Amid the panic, she exploded on stage, leaving behind nothing but flesh and blood. Elizabeth, who could have peacefully lived out her old age, ultimately destroyed herself through greed and vanity.